Now, let's talk about some people who are very important for us to remember, because these people are going to put their lives on the line for something larger than themselves. Let's start with Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass was the son of a black woman and an unknown white man. And Frederick Douglass would become a leading spokesperson for the abolition of slavery and for racial equality. Now, as a runaway slave, he dedicated himself to education and abolition. And in 1845, Frederick Douglass would write his autobiography and become one of the most controversial figures in the United States. And on July 4th, 1852, Douglass will be invited to speak on the significance of the 4th of July to Africans in Rochester, New York. In the speech, he will vilify America for its hypocrisy concerning independence while slavery existed. So let's watch a brief film clip from the History Channel that helps us appreciate the significance of this man.
Frederick Douglass becomes a symbol of the liberation of slaves in the country. Frederick Douglass, born a slave, that somehow has the audacity and drive to run away from slavery and decides to become a leader against slavery. So not only does he have the mental capacity to see himself free, he has the audacity to say, I can speak for the slaves better than the abolitionists that speak on our behalf and don't understand our pain.
Frederick Douglass is important to America because, unlike most enslaved people in America, he actually makes it out of slavery, is able to tell his story, and is able to actually become an agent for change in the black community, in America in general.
Frederick Douglass traveled the length and width and breadth of this country as a leading abolitionist that made the issue of slavery a paramount issue through his editing newspapers, through his ceaseless travels and lectures. He helped to make it a real movement that by the time Abe Lincoln is running against Douglass, it is a national discussion. It would not have happened if you didn't have a spokesperson that worked as tirelessly as Frederick Douglass did.
Douglass is someone who is known in this country. He travels to England. He's an international figure. So he's important because he can tell you about slavery, the institution of slavery, because he lived it, and he can speak about that time period. He can tell you about escaping to freedom, and he can tell you about the free world. He bridges gaps. He's a part of transformation of America at this pivotal moment. And it's someone who, as I said, who begins under the cover of slavery and then ends outside of it.
Okay, that's Frederick Douglass. Now, one of the most controversial Supreme Court decisions that added fuel to the fire over the issue of slavery was Chief Justice Taney's decision in Dred Scott versus Sandford in 1857. It's commonly referred to as the Dred Scott decision. Now, this decision relates to the contemporary immigrant experience today because, well, Americans recognize that undocumented immigrants are citizens of this nation. Now, Taney ruled that people of African descent imported into the United States and held as slaves, or their descendants, whether or not they were slaves, were not protected by the Constitution and could never be citizens of the United States. It also held that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in federal territories. The court also ruled that because slaves were not citizens, they could not sue in court. And lastly, the court ruled that slaves, as chattel or private property, could not be taken away from their owners without due process. So let's watch a film clip on this famous decision.
In 1857, the Supreme Court was a decidedly partisan institution. Of the 9 Supreme Court justices, 7 were pro-slavery Democrats. 5 came from slaveholding families. Their desire to secure the rights of slaveholders would cause them to make the most infamous judicial decision in American history. The man who started it all was named Dred Scott.
Dred Scott was a slave born in Virginia. His master ultimately moves him to St. Louis, where he is sold a couple of times and ultimately ends up in the hands of a man named John Emerson. John Emerson is an army surgeon. And when John Emerson is posted to various frontier forts, the first one is in what is today Rock Island, Illinois, he takes Dred Scott with him as his servant. Now, presumably, Dred Scott becomes free the moment he's taken to Rock Island, because Rock Island is in Illinois. It's called Fort Armstrong at the time. But Dred Scott remains a slave at Fort Armstrong. And then his master takes him to Fort Snelling, which is today St. Paul, Minnesota. Now that is area that was made free under the Missouri Compromise.
Several years later, Dred Scott returned to St. Louis with his master. But after Emerson died, Scott sued for his freedom on the grounds that since he had lived in free territory, he was no longer a slave. A jury of 12 white men in a St. Louis circuit court judged him legally free.
2 years later, the Missouri Supreme Court reverses this. They reverse precedents going back to the beginning of Missouri statehood. And they are very frank about it. They say times have changed.
When John Emerson's widow remarried, she transferred ownership of Dred Scott to her brother, John Sanford.
John Sanford lives in New York, but has business interests in St. Louis. And so now Dred Scott can sue in federal court alleging he is a citizen of Missouri, his owner is a citizen of New York. And that's how the case goes forward to the Supreme Court.
No suit pressed by a slave had ever come before the Supreme Court before. It raised important questions.
The lawyers representing John Sanford made the argument that no black person can sue in federal court because black people can't be citizens of the United States.
The majority opinion in Dred Scott was written by Chief Justice Roger Taney. Taney was a resolute foe of racial equality, the Republican Party, and the anti-slavery movement.
Chief Justice Taney begins by saying Dred Scott can't sue because blacks can't be citizens. And he makes a very famous statement. He says at the time of the Constitution, they had no rights, they meaning blacks, had no rights that the white people needed to respect. Now, having said that Dred Scott can't sue, the technical legal thing Taney should have done was said case dismissed. Because obviously if Dred Scott can't sue, then he can't be in court. Taney can't hear the case any longer.
But Chief Justice Taney didn't stop there.
Taney goes on to face another constitutional question of whether Congress could constitutionally have passed the Missouri Compromise. Did Congress have the power to prohibit slavery in the Western territories? And here he makes an argument based on the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. The Fifth Amendment says you cannot be deprived of your property without due process of law. And so he makes the argument that the federal territories cannot ban slavery because slavery is a fundamentally protected property within the United States constitutional scheme. He says, basically, look, the Constitution is pro-slavery. We have a pro-slavery country. Slavery is a protected property. It's protected more than any other kind of property. And it's protected in the territories. This was also, by the way, essentially a drop-dead letter to the New Republican Party, because the New Republican Party, organized in 1854 after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, was based on the theory that you should stop slavery from spreading into the territories.
We fearlessly declare that there never was under the whole heaven a more atrocious, wholesale wickedness perpetrated upon the bench of justice than this.
Such a decision cannot stand. All that is merciful and just on earth and in heaven will execrate and despise this edict of Taney.
The nation has achieved a triumph. Sectionalism has been rebuked and abolitionism has been staggered and stunned.
Dred Scott himself was purchased by the sons of a former owner and set free a year later. But the controversy surrounding the Dred Scott decision did not quickly die down.
It's that third element in the triangle of disasters, I suppose, in the pre-Civil War decade, and that here now the court has joined the politicians in making a decision in this case in which the Supreme Court decides basically that Dred Scott and by extension all black Americans have no constitutional rights that whites are bound to respect.